Thank you very much. It's a great privilege and a joy to be here. The topic they've assigned to me is there Catholic media? And I added another question to that: is the media for Catholics? Let me begin by little references to the Bible and the lens of the Bible. On the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea in southern Israel, is the site of the Essene development or settlement where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered by a Bedouin shepherd boy in 1947. The scrolls, removed from a cave that day and the days following, would come to be recognized as the greatest manuscript treasure ever found, the first 7 manuscripts of the now famous Dead Sea Scrolls. The Essenes, that ascetic Jewish sect of the Second Temple, were a somewhat fanatical religious group that existed from about 200 BC to 75 AD. They deliberately built their community in an inaccessible site. They were a group of priests and laymen pursuing a common life of strict dedication to God. Their leader was called the Righteous Teacher. They viewed themselves as the only true elect of Israel, who alone were faithful to the law. The Essenes were convinced that the leaders and people in Jerusalem had clearly lost their way and had become unfaithful to God. So these devout Jews fled to Qumran to clear their heads and to prepare for the coming of the Messiah. The Essene writings, the big body of writings that we found in the caves, revealed the mood of messianic fanaticism among the Jews of the time, and they have disclosed much about the nature of the Essene community, their way of life and beliefs, as well as many details about the Second Temple and its rituals and worship. Their texts provide us with a very good background picture of one aspect of the religious world into which Jesus of Nazareth was born. I began my presentation with the story of Qumran and the Essene community because I believe that it offers the Church one paradigm of how to deal with the world, with news, with media, with communications. There are some people, and even leaders in the Church today, who feel very much like the Essene leaders. They feel that they are the only true elect of the Church, the only remaining faithful who have not lost their way. In their mind, the only way to deal with the world and to communicate with the world is to flee from it and construct a community or a base in a very inaccessible site, like the one that's at the Dead Sea today. When you visit Qumran today, you take a bus, and rather than turning left and go up the Jordan Valley, you turn right and go into the middle of the wilderness, and you experience ruins. They built a hermetically sealed fortress that kept the outside world outside. Communications, for them, became an internal affair, preaching to the restricted gallery of the saved, the clean, and people who were basically like-minded and non-problematic. I do not believe that the Qumran method, which is a word that's often used, is the way to deal with the world today. Rather than fleeing the confusion and the ambiguity of our age and hiding in the nostalgia of the past that's now buried in the heart and in the mercy of God, some of us have to remain in the city, in the thick of things, in the present, offering the world the unambiguous message of the gospel, the teaching of the Church, a ray of hope, and a dose of badly needed joy. And we have to do this work on different media platforms simultaneously. It's no longer print alone. It's no longer television alone. It's no longer this alone or that alone. It's now everything all at once, simultaneously. Try all platforms to communicate with this outside world. Jesus did not make his home base on the shores of the Dead Sea, but rather in the very cosmopolitan Capernaum on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And here I would simply say, if you haven't been to Capernaum or haven't had the privilege to go to Galilee, you might walk across the street into the big registration center and see the wonderful display that's been set up through the efforts of communion and liberation through the eyes of the apostles, where they've recreated the village of Capernaum. In that little fishing village, strategically located on the extension of the Via Maris, Jesus had regular dealings with many people, including tax collectors and a Roman centurion who was kind enough to build the synagogue for the folks there. Jesus was very much at home in Capernaum, not in Jerusalem nor at the Dead Sea. Though clearly not a politician, Jesus had a very keen sense of politics and rarely turned down an invitation to dinner. He bonded himself with the unclean, with the sick, the dying, with sinners, with those with ambiguous lifestyles, and those living on the fringes of society. He befriended sinners and the wretched of his times, never condoning their behavior, but inviting them to an alternative, better lifestyle. He teaches us by being with people. He heals, he restores, he renews, and reconciles broken humanity. And he did it in a remarkably unambiguous, clear, simple way. He asked his followers to go to the ends of the earth, and not just to places where they were comfortable or safe. He always spoke in a language that people understood, and he used media that people found accessible. He was the ultimate communicator. The parables are the perfect example of that. His incarnation was God's greatest communication with humankind. His challenge remains the same to us today. To do this effectively, we must engage with the traditional media and what we now call the new media, whether as a communicator or a consumer. The most effective way we can use the media is by bearing true witness to the message we seek to deliver. The strength of our message and our stories lie in the authenticity and transparency with which they are presented. In using the media to communicate, to teach, and to evangelize, we must never lose sight of the need to reach and teach the individual as though he or she were the only person being addressed. We need to keep our focus on reaching the world, always with a message of hope, a theme that has been central to the teachings of Pope Benedict XVI, especially in his magnificent encyclical, Spe Salvi, By Hope We Were Saved. We have to have a passion for the truth, always seeking in depth that solid soil of the vital relationship with God and others, a place to really build a culture of respect, of dialogue, and of friendship, and a way of respecting the dignity of every man and woman. We have got a long way to go yet in the media, both in the church and in public media establishments. Barrier walls and hostilities that exist between media and church must be overcome. It serves no purpose for church officials, church leaders, and individuals to vilify those involved in the media, to stonewall and not respond to those constant urgent phone calls or emails or text messages of this reporter, that producer, some editor. That's the nature of the beast. They don't call it breaking news for nothing. Nor does it serve any purpose for those working in media establishments to ignore or marginalize the church and religious issues and reduce them into banal, trivial matters that do not merit serious reflection or the ability to tell the whole story. We have much to learn from each other, and we have much good work to do together to serve the cause of truth and decency in a world that is becoming more devoid of value, virtue, and meaning. The most profound realities and truths cannot be reduced to sound bites, and this is a lesson that the public media has to learn more and more. At the same time, we have to realize that passing on these truths, we must synthesize them, clarify them, crystallize them, so the central part of the message gets out. And there's a difference between synthesizing and crystallizing and clarifying and soundbiting things. what is required of Catholics who wish to enter the arena of the media in small and big ways is prudence, wisdom, intelligence, savvy, humor, and above all, humanity. And dealing with the media today is not the sole work of designated church communications personnel, some who know the trade well and the importance of proactive and active work, while others, thinking that they might be experts, know the trade poorly, always remaining in fearful, reactive, and crusading modes of response. We will all make big mistakes and blunders in venturing forward on the media stage. But we can learn from those mistakes, let go of grudges and old animosities, and build a collaborative future. Now let's recall several key points about media involvement, media work, media presence. Contemporary media are not inherently evil or sinful. Putting energy and creativity into positive expressions will help build a more humane media environment. Catholics involved in the media have a great responsibility to humanize a very difficult world. And therefore, those Catholics who are involved in Catholic media are not only there to preach to the gallery of those on the inside, but to humanize the public media. And believe it or not, that is possible. It's slow, but it's possible. At the same time, as the media dramatically reshapes society, we must be cautious and wary of the negative side, the shadow side. Let us also not be fooled to think that mass media today is morally neutral. It is often subordinated to big-time economic interests intent on dominating the market and to attempts to impose cultural models that serve ideological and political agendas. The media have a huge role in shaping attitudes, a role that has been amplified by globalization. That requires careful reflection on their influence, especially when it comes to questions of ethics and solidarity dimensions of human development. Media have a civilizing effect when they're geared toward a vision of the human person, the dignity of the human person, and the common good that reflects the truly universal values. That means they need to focus on promoting human dignity, be inspired by charity, and be placed at the service of truth. Rather than simply rejecting or ignoring, for example, all this new media, which makes some people shiver and shudder in their boots, we should focus on the ways that we can use the new media to reflect and express our values and help us provide models of empathy, solidarity, and respect for the human person. In doing so, we participate in the redemption of new media and the renewal and evangelization of the Christian community and of the world. One of the prized values in the media industry or the media world is impartiality in presenting news and current affairs. Impartiality, or some people would say objectivity. But there's a mythological side to objectivity as well. Sometimes this objectivity or impartiality mean that both sides of a case must be presented, ideally, within the specific program or series. And in the public areas of media, there's a great premium on objectivity or impartiality. But for those of us who are responding to the world from the perspective of the church, we should be very wary sometimes of the exaggerations of impartiality or objectivity. To show impartiality, for example, in a single program, an interviewer will present critical questions and challenges of the person interviewed. This often leads to a claim that interviewers are anti the opinion of the person they are interviewing. So what happens is, whenever a Catholic is interviewed, the interviewer will take the opposite point of view. This means they may sound anti-Catholic to some people, but they sound equally anti-something and anti-whatever to the people being interviewed or the person being interviewed. Attempting to handle topics with impartiality can be handled sympathetically and also can be handled very badly. My recommendation is to be very cautious in when we're presenting or dealing with issues involving impartiality and objectivity, if our point is to get across church teachings or church messaging. At the same time, it's not bad to get some loyal opposition at times and to feature that and to show that we are capable of maintaining a civil and humane dialogue about issues. Several weeks ago, for example, are some interviewers and programs anti-Catholic? The answer is absolutely yes. And I must say here, and I say it in this audience too, I've been surprised at some of the coverage of the Eucharistic Congress by some of your secular press. It is to be regretted deeply, is what has happened. At the same time, it presents a challenge to you and to all of those involved in the communications and media establishment in this country. I just came from a 1-hour national radio program on RTE that was taped, perhaps it was live. Anyway, it was a wonderful panel, and I must compliment the woman who led the discussion in which very delicate issues were raised. But the way that was planned tells everything. The dialogue that goes into preparation for that program, knowledge of the speakers, knowledge of the issues, and a willingness before the interview takes place to sit down and say, that's fair and that's very unfair. This interview went very well, and I'm involved in something tomorrow and also on Sunday with the wrap-up program with RTE. But this takes a lot of planning and setting things out and getting to know the people. You don't walk into these things cold. In the media world, there is much animosity towards the Catholic Church. This is absolutely undeniable. Many have personal prejudices as well. Crises in the Church, particularly the devastating abuse crisis that has plagued this country and many countries, have provided good fodder and ammunition to many to distrust the Church. It is tiring, however, to hear Catholics and people of faith condemning the public television networks or even smaller religious television networks for being anti-Catholic simply because the network or the group involved attempted to present the whole picture and the complexity of it. For example, we should be very grateful in some cases to different countries where the public media helped us to clean up our act in the Church, especially regarding the abuse crisis. Several weeks ago, I know at our Salt and Light television network, which is Canada's national television network and radio, we presented a very measured, objective manner the mess that's unfolding at the Vatican right now with the famous Vatileaks, or the leaks. We presented that following basically the statements of Father Federico Lombardi, a wonderful Jesuit and the director of the Holy See Press Office. I was deluged with phone calls, nasty and threatening messages telling me I should never show such disrespect to the Vatican and admit that there were leaks. I said, "What newspapers are you reading?" "It's happening." No, that's all invented," they said. "You as a Catholic priest involved in media must never say anything negative about the Church. This is disrespectful to the Holy Father." She went on and got 50 of her friends to call as well. There are many who express the same idea. Others complain, on the other hand, that we present happy, positive stories of Catholic life, stating that we should be speaking about hell and damnation, corruption and evil that exists in the Church. So you see, when you're sitting in my office or walking in my shoes, sometimes you get up in the morning and say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, what am I supposed to do today? And what are we supposed to say?" The goal is clarity, honesty, transparency, and truth. And I think we're extremely blessed. Maybe you don't know him, but you certainly hear his name, in the person of my colleague and friend, Father Federico Lombardi. What a difficult position for anybody to be in at any moment in church history. But the saving grace, and all the journalists will say this in Rome, is humanity, simplicity, clarity, and a smile, even in a mess. The future of religious broadcasting lies not in demanding more dedicated religious programming, but really the impetus is on us, the demand is upon us to create programs that inform, that educate, that entertain. This, in fact, may be a better way to communicate faith to a secular society that literally switches off when religion is presented as education and instruction. Think of some of the great success stories in your part of the world, the monastery, other programs that were able to penetrate that world of indifference and cynicism. They were huge successes. No serious public service broadcaster is going to ignore religion But neither are going to be cheerleaders for our cause. Churches and faith communities need to understand the parameters of the modern media environment and work within them, helping creative programmers and makers to find new approaches to religious broadcasting, approaches that will inform and entertain according to contemporary criteria of good TV and good radio. And if we're going to embark in the world of religious broadcasting or religious media, it must be well thought out, it must be good, it must be beautiful, and it must be professional if we want to speak to the world around us. If you want to be like Qumran, and you want to speak to this insular group that's afraid of the outside world, you simply play to the gallery all the time, and it's pretty boring. With the digital age upon us, we are seeing a considerable diminishment of Catholic and Christian press. The churches cannot ignore the great potential of online media if they wish to keep the truths of the faith in close touch with the emerging culture, and especially the younger growing generations. At the same time, we cannot ignore the old media because many less developed countries around the world still rely on rather traditional technologies. We communicate with many countries where the internet is still dial-up. You still hear that that noise when you used to call up the old internet. It was a deafening noise. The task of church communicators, of journalists and broadcasters, is to keep working to develop and use the new age media, not new age, to use the media of the new age to communicate the God forbid. If the bishops are present here, I did not mean that, okay? Is working to develop and use new media to communicate the gospel to this age, our contemporary age. A single medium is no longer enough to capture the full attention of the audience. That's what I'm trying to say. And you know who the key actors are in this? As much as we have such well-meaning, well-intentioned adults with lots of experience, if you want this whole thing to work, put it in the hands of trained 20-somethings and 30-somethings. This is their generation. I'll tell you more about that later, but it's the greatest risk that I took and the greatest blessing I have received by learning from that generation. Let me tell you a little funny thing that just happened before I came over here. This is why it's important to have 20-somethings or 30-somethings close to you. I was in the press room, sitting on the top floor, quietly for the last hour, and I went to one of the computers that's available there to send some messages. Very quietly, the press room was filled with all kinds of journalists. A young Belgian man came over to me after I had been there for 45 minutes. He said, "Father, you write English very well." And thank you. He said, I said, "How do you know?" He says, "I've been reading all your emails on the big screen up there." I said, "On the big screen?" I looked up, and he said, "You forgot to touch that switch." He said, "The big screen is taking from the small screen." And I said, "Antoine, did you read everything?" He said, "No, I picked out a couple words." He said, "You didn't write anything bad." Keep the young people close to you, believe me. Visual and electronic media, today's dominant media, need a certain kind of content. They thrive on brevity, speed, change, urgency. 3G, 4G. Every time I have a new equipment there, somebody comes and says, "What is it?" I said, "It's a 3G. "Oh, I'm sorry." "What do you mean I'm sorry?" "What's your computer?" I put the computer on. I'm sitting on the plane. I have a young person sitting next to me, and they say, "Oh, it's too bad." I said, "What do you mean it's too bad?" "Your computer's old." Thank you. Thinking, though, takes time. Thinking takes time. It needs silence and the methodical skills of logic. And this is one of the great risks with all the rapid stuff. You would never write some of the things you put in an email in a letter or in a paper. And so we have to really be very cautious with this whole new world, but it's tremendously exciting. These new forms of media have oftentimes undermined the intellectual discipline that we once had when our main tools of communication were books or print publications. Material progress, rapidity, is never an unmixed blessing. New media also includes the viral world. Video clips that go viral can reach many people, much more than anybody watching a TV program. Churches need to be aware of these developments. Those involved in communications need to be plugged in and tuned into this. And this is the age of the new evangelization, when if your new evangelization personnel or agent or whatever in your diocese isn't aware of this, it's not new evangelization. We need to be aware of these developments and seize the momentum and enter these worlds. What's the goal? To get our message out, to get our story out, to get our press release out, and ultimately to evangelize. We cannot fool ourselves into thinking that a perfect communication strategy could ever make it possible for us to communicate every message that the church has to offer in a way that avoids contradiction and conflict. In all honesty, success in this sense would be a bad sign, indicating ambiguity or compromise rather than authentic communication. You see, the search for meaning is the most powerful force in the world. What we need to do, especially those involved in Catholic communications and media, is to show the culture that we're not against them, that we've got a compelling, beautiful story, and that story can actually change circumstances and change lives. When this happens, people will listen. We must avoid providing what are portrayed as easy and simplistic answers for every question addressed to us. Often, the right answers are very difficult, and they take clarity and time. And in dealing with media sometimes, the best way to get the message across is to sit down with the person writing the story, sit down with the editor, and try to explain things slowly and carefully. Sometimes they'll listen. In every age, the church has used whatever media are available to get the message across and to spread the good news. Think, for example, of St. Augustine, who practically invented the form of the autobiography. Think of the builders of the great medieval cathedrals, who used stone and stained glass to tell the story, to communicate. Think of the Renaissance popes. They used not only papal bulls, but colorful frescoes. And they cheaply paid artists to make some of the most beautiful pieces of artwork that are there to teach a message. Think of Hildegard of Bingen, soon to be proclaimed Doctor of the Church, who's said to have written one of the first operas to get across a message. Think of the early Jesuits who used theater and stagecraft to put on morality plays of their time for entire towns. Think of that remarkable American-born woman, Dorothy Day, who founded the simple Catholic worker newspaper to get across the social teachings of the church. Think of the Jesuit, Father Daniel Lord, who jumped into radio and didn't have any training. Think of my former bishop growing up in Rochester, New York, a man named Fulton Sheen, who used television with tremendous success and was an Emmy Award winner. Think of all of those cardinals and bishops and priests and sisters and brothers and Catholic lay leaders who not only write letters, but they blog and they tweet. And then don't forget an Italian-American woman by the name of Rita Antoinette Rizzo. Some of you know her by the other name, Mother Angelica. She founded the Eternal Word television network, a network that we work very closely with, out of a barn on her property in the deep south of the United States. What good could come from Nazareth? What good can come from Birmingham? Say what you wish about her, she's one of the most chutzpah-filled women I have ever met and known. I was one of the last people to see her before she had her stroke. The lesson she gave me, I still laugh, which is brilliant. And then think of that wonderful American-born priest, Father Robert Barron of the Archdiocese of Chicago, who's given us a new way of transmitting Catholic apologetics through this brilliant series, Catholicism. He's a great friend and colleague and partner in crime. This evening, I want to highlight, however, two individuals from our Catholic tradition who were, for me, media models, masters, mentors in the area of communication, in the area of evangelization, in the area of using symbol and media to get the story across. First one lived a long time ago, but his name is still around. Francis of Assisi. He started to convey the Christmas story through a nativity scene that he enacted in the Umbrian hilltop town of Greccio on December 25th, 1223. He made a living nativity scene to be able to contemplate and adore Jesus, but above all, to know how to best pass the message on that the Son of God became flesh and pitched his tent among us. He became a humble little baby. Francis's intuition was rather astonishing. The nativity scene is not only a new Bethlehem because it reevokes the historical event and focuses attention on its message, but it's also an occasion of tremendous consolation and deep happiness. Think of your own reactions when you set up the manger scene in your house at Christmas or in your church, playing with the figures, moving them around. Do the camels come this day or they come that day? When do you put the baby in the straw? How much straw do you use? How many years have you used the same straw? And all of those things. This is thanks to Francis. The nativity scene celebrates the covenant. It's a much bigger story than the little figurines. It celebrates the covenant between God and man, between earth and heaven. Thanks to Francis, Christians are able to understand that at Christmas, God truly is Emmanuel, God with us, from whom no barrier or distance separates us. In that little child, God became so close to us that we establish an intimate rapport of profound affection with him, just as we do with a newborn baby. That is communications and media at the service of the truth. Francis did not go to television school or media school. Interestingly, Claire, his partner, is the patron of television networks, because as she was very sick in bed and she could not get out of bed, people say that a vision appeared on the wall of her bedroom in which she saw Mass being celebrated in St. Francis Basilica. The second communication expert I want to tell you about, one much closer to us, to our moment in history. Let me take you back to his big media entry onto the world stage. I remember it well. I was a university student. It was a fall evening, to be precise, October the 16th, 1978, when the Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyła walked out onto the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica. Hanno chiamato un vescovo da lontano. They called a bishop from a far country. Following the white smoke from that now familiar Sistine Chapel chimney, the stranger was presented to the world as John Paul II, and he spoke personally to the huge crowd in St. Peter's Square, going beyond the prescribed words of the Urbi and Orbi blessing. He bonded, he connected immediately, describing himself as the man from a distant country, now called to Rome. He invited those who heard him to correct his Italian. Imagine a pope saying that. From the very beginning of his pontificate, the youthful, athletic pope took the world by storm. Many people said, where he went, he took the center stage with him. The media knew from the beginning that they had a friend in that church leader. And church-media relations were forever changed on that unforgettable night. We witnessed those changes on a daily basis over the next 27 years. Several years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing General Jaruzelski, who was head of the Communist Brigade at the time of communist rule in Poland. I asked him, through an interpreter, when did you know it was over? And without batting an eyelash, without missing a beat, he said, October the 16th, 1978 at 4:30 in the afternoon. I said, really? He said, we knew that the nails were in the coffin then. For 3 months, during the winter and spring of 2005, the world received another media lesson. It was inundated with words, stories, and profoundly moving ceremonies coming to us from Rome, images that helped us recall, recapitulate, and evaluate this world charismatic leader's mission and life. In this age of titillating television reality shows depicting the crudest form of human existence, the world was invited during those months to take part in another reality show of deep pathos and emotion. First in the papal apartments, then from the Gemelli Polyclinic, then at the Apostolic Palace in those final days. The 2005 reality show invited the whole world into the passion of John Paul II, the mystery of his suffering and dying, of life and death and new life. Rather than hide his infirmities as most public figures do, he let the whole world see what he went through. The Vatican reality show reached its apex in the octave of Easter of 2005 and was an extraordinary teaching moment for the Church and for the world. It was brought to us by the media and choreographed by the star himself, John Paul II. It came as no surprise, for the late Pope remarked on several occasions, in private and in public discourse, and in my hearing on 2 occasions, if it doesn't happen on television, it doesn't happen. Through his nearly 27-year pontificate, John Paul taught us that communication is power. He told us how to use that power wisely. Prudently and wisely get your message out so it will have a shot at bearing fruit, despite obstacles. And if anyone knew obstacles, John Paul II did, having lived and long and prospered, despite being faced from his beginning with the tyranny of Nazism and communism. Hiding our message will not do any good to anyone. Like the mustard seed in the New Testament parable, we must sow generously and then reap. Blessed John Paul taught us that there's much more to the church and the papacy than preaching, speaking, writing, greeting people, and traveling, although he certainly did enough of all of those. He communicated through spontaneous, symbolic actions that were often more eloquent than some of his speeches, homilies, and encyclicals, especially his final moments on the world stage. Those actions were powerful symbols. The word symbol comes from the Greek word symbolein, which means to bring together. It is the opposite of the Greek word diabolein, which means to break apart or to divide, the origin of our word diabolical. Symbolic actions help to bring people together in peace and in love. Up to the moment of his death, and even after, John Paul was bringing people together in peace and in love. This is communication at the service of truth. This is the effort of human decency to humanize the media world. Karl Joseph Wojtyła began his historic service to the world with the words that would become the refrain of an entire pontificate. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors to Christ. Would that many of us in the church and the media world take those words to heart. Do not be afraid. Think of the walls that might come tumbling down. Imagine the bridges that would be built. Interestingly enough, the last major formal document of his pontificate was an apostolic letter that was released on January the 24th, 2005, entitled The Rapid Development. The contents of this remarkable pastoral letter were somewhat eclipsed by the late Pope's final suffering and death and the election of his successor. In fact, the day that the letter was released was the day he was rushed to the hospital to have that surgery. The letter was addressed to those responsible for communications and contains an important message to every media mogul, copy editor, reporter, writer, broadcaster, producer, webmaster, and blogger, whether Roman Catholic or not. In that letter, he spoke about a spirituality of communication, one of the major contributions that is none other than his testament on social communications. It is not a coincidence that the last document of this great pope and communicator was on the theme of communications. For if any church leader ever embodied and exemplified the great communicator, it was Karol Wojtyła, blessed John Paul II. In Rapid Development, John Paul wrote, and I quote, "The media provides a providential opportunity to reach people everywhere, overcoming barriers of time, of space, and of language, presenting the content of faith in the most varied ways imaginable, and offering to all who search the possibility of entering into dialogue with the mystery of God revealed fully in Jesus Christ." He said, communicators must be witnesses of values that are good for society, but there was also a stern warning in that letter and a challenge. He said, many people, in fact, believe that humanity must learn to live in a climate governed by an absence of meaning, by the provisional and by the fleeting. In this context, the communications media can be used to proclaim the gospel or to reduce it to silence within people's hearts. I believe that rapid development should be required reading for every single person who wants to get involved in communications and media, and for every single person who wants to work with young people in the church. For this document, far from being merely a manual for communications workers, is a charter for those who wish to evangelize the modern world, especially through multiple simultaneous platforms available to us today. And if any generation of young people has been entrusted with the mission and vocation of evangelization through media, it's this generation. We must not let them down. We must involve them in our efforts to communicate and to evangelize. In conclusion, people constantly ask me these past years, the past 10 years especially, where I did my media training in film studies. I laugh and sometimes burst out laughing and tell them I don't even watch TV. I see few movies. I studied scripture at the University of Toronto, at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, and at the École Biblique and Archéologique Française de Jérusalem, and at the Hebrew University. One does not learn in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic how to make movies. I learned about ancient texts, Greek, Hebrew, and all kinds of other things, and I learned about the past. I never studied filmmaking, media, and public relations, and all the other high-tech things that have now been forced upon me in my new lexicon. But I also tell them, I didn't realize what was happening when it was happening, but I had the privilege of having a master and a mentor who knew the power of words and images and who taught me everything I know about television, media, and evangelization. It was a character study, close up, for 27 years. A master class I never sought out and certainly never deserved. And it culminated in a close association with him for 4 years as I led the World Youth Day in Canada. Blessed John Paul taught us how to engage the culture around us. There's a certain time for confronting the culture with the message of the gospel and the church, but such confrontation, he taught me, must be done with civility, conviction, firmness, and charity. We need to show the culture through the media that we're not against them. We've got a compelling, beautiful story, and that story can change circumstances. When this happens, people will listen as they stopped and listened to the story of John Paul II. And in doing so, especially in the end, when the words failed, the world stopped, listened, watched, and learned. How can this story continue for us today? Benedict XVI has used very creatively the image of the courtyard of the Gentiles. Not a remote encampment far from the city on the shores of the Dead Sea, but in a very inaccessible place. The courtyard of the Gentiles idea was the part of the Jerusalem temple that was open to all peoples, the part that our Lord cleared of the money changers. Today, too, Benedict says, the church should be an open sort of courtyard of Gentiles, in which people might latch on to God without knowing him and before gaining access to his mystery. There should be a dialogue with those to whom religion is something foreign, to whom God is unknown, and who nevertheless do not want to be left merely godless, but rather to draw near to him, albeit as the unknown God. People are drawn to the church in order to find spiritual purpose. They are not godless. They wish to learn from our wisdom. This is part of the new evangelization that will lead some, but not all, to church membership. Many people today seek meaning and purpose in life, be they affluent or poor, evangelized or unevangelized, wandering and searching. This contemporary search defines our work in broadcast media, and especially in the area of Catholic communications. Handled properly, the media can indeed be the courtyard of the Gentiles for the 21st century. It requires us to learn the vocabulary, to learn the culture and the language of the cultures around us, and to draw carefully from the symbols that are there, to make connections, to link people together, and to invite them to a mystery far greater than we ever imagined. I want you to watch now how we did this, how we took these ideas and put them into practice in a small, humble way in creating the Salt and Light television network in Canada. It is the first fruit of the World Youth Day of our country that we celebrated 10 years ago. And I have a feeling that a great friend and intercessor in heaven might be smiling when he realizes that we took his words very seriously.
They said it would connect us all.
Until we are parts of the same whole.
A global network of people who can read each other in an instant. But how connected are we really?
To who we are and where we're going. In 2003, young people began a multimedia ministry to ask serious questions and look for answers about who we are, about faith, about a present and a future full of hope.
Full of hope.
And so Salt and Light was born.
Does social networking make our relationships better or worse?
Hi, this is Byron.
And this is Rosanna, and welcome to
In Your Faith.
What gives you hope for the future of the church?
I went there just for the sake of helping other people, and I found like happiness I didn't know I could have.
He moved through his suffering to find for people's lives a new meaning. That was the miracle.
Touching the stone made them feel something inside them.
You've been telling us how you feel about what we're doing.
You ask us to keep on going.
And we do it all with you and for you.
Because when you find something that makes life that much more beautiful, you just have to share it.
So that we can all have a part of it.
And experience a connection that takes us beyond ourselves. Until we become for each other a light. A light for the world.
Lord Jesus Christ, you have called them to be the salt of the earth and light of the world.
Questions or comments or anything?